How can women trust the police? A Met elite officer revealed as one of the country's most prolific sex offenders. David Carrick admitted to scores of offences against women over the course of 18 years, including 24 cases of rape. Equally horrifying is that despite repeated allegations against him, the Met failed to kick him out.
I recognise that we failed, and I'm sorry, and I know we've let women down. I have tens of thousands of great men and women who really care about policing London, but it's also very obvious I have hundreds of people who shouldn't be here, and we haven't been tough enough about dealing with that.
In yet another dark day for the Met, the notion that the problem is just a few bad apples lies in the dust too. 1,000 of its officers are now being investigated for alleged sexual offences and domestic abuse. So where does this leave policing, not just in the capital, but beyond too? Chloe and Paul will take us through it. Also on News at 10 tonight. Now, the teachers are to strike too. Thousands of schools in England and Wales set to close in February. Sunak on a constitutional collision course with Sturgeon. UK government blocks Scotland's gender ID law. Peter has the latest. Jeremy Clarkson's big apology to Harry and Meghan. So how did they respond? And is Amazon about to drop him? And...
You know, you don't look like a nurse.
I assure you I am. But I doubt if it's a nurse you require.
The Italian screen star hailed the most beautiful woman in the world. Gina Lollobrigida dies at 95.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. The case of PC David Carrick has shone a searing light upon yet more scarcely believable failings by London's Metropolitan Police, even by the force's now historically low standards. Today, PC Carrick pleaded guilty to 24 rapes and as many other crimes against women, 12 different women, including attempted rape, sexual assault and possessing a gun to cause fear. During his reign of terror, which lasted 18 years, the Metropolitan Police had 9 opportunities to stop him and didn't. He used his status as a police officer, an armed police officer, to trick them, control them and silence them. He's also set back trust in the Metropolitan Police, rocked by other scandals. The Commissioner of the Force, Sir Mark Rowley, accepted it had failed and said he needed to be ruthless in rooting out those who corrupt its integrity.
As a Metropolitan Police officer, PC David Carrick was supposed to protect people. Instead, he preyed on them. A serial rapist who used his position first to seduce and then to scare his victims into staying silent. In court today, he admitted to a terrifying total of 49 offences, nearly half of them rape charges, prompting the head of the force he worked for to apologise to the women he abused.
I recognise that we failed, and I'm sorry, and I know we've let women down. I have tens of thousands of great men and women who really care about policing London, but it's also very obvious I have hundreds of people who shouldn't be here, and we haven't been tough enough about dealing with that.
PC Carrick worked as an armed officer in the Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Command. During almost 2 decades of service, he abused that position to gain his victims' trust.
PC David Carrick repeatedly humiliated his victims, locking women in the understairs cupboard of his Hertfordshire home or forcing them to clean the house naked. He referred to women as his slaves, telling them when they could sleep and eat, and in some cases, urinating on them.
But his crimes went undetected by the force he worked for, despite his behaviour being brought to its attention no fewer than 9 times. In 2000, Carrick was accused of burglary and sending abusive messages. Despite this, he passed the vetting procedure to join the Metropolitan Police the next year. Whilst serving, he was accused of harassment and assault in 2002 and a domestic incident in 2004. Despite several more allegations against him, none of which led to criminal prosecutions, Carrick was successfully re-vetted in 2017. In July 2021, after being arrested on suspicion of rape, he was placed on restricted duties. But 2 months later, those restrictions were lifted after the charges were dropped. It was only in October 2021 that he was finally suspended from the Met after another accusation of rape by a woman he'd met on a dating app.
This is a man who relentlessly degraded, belittled, sexually assaulted and raped women. As time went on, the severity of his offending intensified as he became emboldened, thinking he would get away with it.
And for 18 years, he did.
This appalling incident represents a breach of trust. It will affect people's confidence in the police, and it's clear that standards and culture need to change.
PC David Carrick's crimes have had a devastating impact on the lives of 12 women. His police force's failure to detect them has destroyed the trust of millions more. Chloe Keedy, News at 10.
And our UK editor Paul is with me. I mean, it is really hard to overstate how grave this is. This goes to the heart of the questions about policing by consent. It goes beyond the Met and, as you know, beyond policing too.
Yeah, I mean, David Carrick was a predator dressed as a protector of women, but his uniform really oughtn't have provided much of a disguise. I mean, the number of missed opportunities here to stop his behaviour can only point to abject failure by the Metropolitan Police. We're talking about opportunities in 2001, 2002, 2004, 2009, 2016, 2017, 2019 and 2021. And on that last occasion, the Met was in the middle of professing that it was going to stop this kind of behaviour just as it was continuing to harbour a rapist within its ranks. Today, the Metropolitan Police Commissioner says that there may be 1,000 Met staff who are potentially posing a danger to the public. But as you say, it doesn't just dwell within the ranks of the Metropolitan Police. I think this is now appearing to be a cultural issue across what I would deem, or you might deem, the hero services, the fire and the police services. We reported last month, for example, on South Wales Fire and Rescue Service, which is facing an independent review of its culture because of the behaviour towards women that we uncovered there. There seems to be this issue of a macho culture in the fire and the police service, of an antiquated culture, of a power dynamic that allows them to abuse vulnerable people that they are supposed to help to protect. Other institutions, other sectors have had their kind of wake-up moment, whether it's the church or whether it's the media. I think that is what the police and the fire service are now going through, and if they don't reform, they really are facing a crisis of trust.
Indeed. OK, Paul, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, the list of public service workers holding strikes grew yet longer today to include teachers in England and Wales. The National Education Union announced 7 days of action in pursuit of its pay claim, though individual schools will only be affected by 4 of them. 3 of those days will be national strikes, the 1st of February and the 15th and 16th of March, affecting all of England and Wales. There are regional strikes then on the 14th and 28th of February and the 1st and 2nd of March. It'll affect more than 23,000 schools, many of which will have to close, disrupting exam preparations, keeping parents at home and hitting the economy.
To last lesson, we started to look at baptism.
It's set to be the biggest shutdown of schools for more than a decade, disrupting learning and a huge headache for parents. Low pay and excessive workloads are at the heart of this escalating dispute. At this school in Keighley, staff say they're continually doing more for less money.
Energy costs have gone up, you know, to put fuel in your car, costs of everything like that has gone up. And teachers' wages in kind of relation to that have not gone up in line with the rate of inflation, the way that inflation's gone up. People have the right to be paid fairly for that.
It's difficult trying to remain passionate, remain healthy, remain sane in something when actually you've got all these external factors on the outside that are making living and working increasingly more difficult.
What do we want? 10%! In Scotland, teachers are already walking out. Now strikes in England and Wales will follow, closing thousands of schools in February and March.
Yes, strike action is disruptive, but life in schools and the access of children and young people to qualified teachers, qualified in the subjects they're teaching, is precarious in so many schools in our country. And there comes a time when the profession has to stand up and make that clear.
The government's offered a pay rise of 5%. That's still below inflation and below the union's demands of 12%. And a key factor in this dispute is how much of any increase would have to be met from existing school budgets. This action will force parents to take time off work and mean more disruption to learning for a generation of children already behind due to COVID.
How do you feel about all of that? It's my GCSE year, so obviously I do want... It would be preferable if teachers were in school, but if they have to strike, they have to strike.
We already lost so much education. We do understand that they do need money, but it will be a struggle for us if we don't have teachers in school.
And head teachers are rapidly working on contingency plans.
The last thing any school practitioner wants to do is close a school. As much as you can pull some groups together and have big assemblies and have big events, if you've got 3 people supervising 330 students, then that becomes an unsafe situation.
A situation ministers hope to avert as talks with unions continue this week.
It is deeply disappointing for parents and children. And of course it will have an impact. It will have an impact on children's education. We all know that during the pandemic they have had a lot of disruption to their education, and we're still trying to catch up from that.
But the warning from teachers is they can't and won't carry on like this for much longer. Today's strike vote is a dramatic escalation of the disruption sweeping the public sector. Sarah Corker, News at 10 in West Yorkshire.
There's a timetable over on our website of which days and which areas are likely to be affected by these walkouts. That's at itv.com/news. Nurses who are members of the RCN union are already due to hold 2 more strike days this week. Today, they announced 2 more in 3 weeks' time. The union says its pay dispute is no nearer to being solved. What the government is doing is pressing on with its plan to ensure minimum levels of service for the public during strikes by nurses and indeed other vital services like teaching, fire and rescue and the railways. Inside Parliament, MPs have been debating that plan. Outside, rail union members have been making their views clear.
We will fight tooth and nail to protect the right to strike.
Taking their protest to the heart of Westminster, union members from the fire service to civil servants to rail workers outraged at what they see as the government's attempt to curb strike action.
Well, it's going to cast a dark shadow over negotiations. I can see this leading to more disputes, not less, longer, more bitterly fought disputes, not quicker and shorter disputes. It's going to completely backfire, but in the meantime this government is showing its true colours. They want to remove the ability of workers to strike. This is about freedom.
Inside the Commons, the debate on the minimum service levels bill that would guarantee a level of cover during strikes was only marginally less heated.
The Sacking Nurses Bill is one of the most indefensible and foolish pieces of legislation to come before this House in modern times. It threatens teachers and nurses with a sack during a recruitment and retention crisis.
Which is not at all how the government sees the legislation.
We are simply asking this question. The unions tell us when they're going to withdraw their labour so that we can agree a minimum safety level. Hardly revolutionary stuff, Madam Deputy Speaker. Just a common-sense safety net to keep the public safe.
Silly boy. That the reaction of one Labour MP. Away from the Commons, negotiations with many unions appear to have stalled, with nurses being the latest to set yet more strike dates in February.
Rishi Sunak needs to get the negotiations open today with the Royal College of Nursing and make sure that we get a resolution to this very, very quickly so that we can retain our nurses, that we can recruit into the profession, but that fundamentally means let's resolve their dispute in 22-23 in relation to their pay.
And are there any talks scheduled, any talks in the diary?
No, there's not.
MPs will vote on the strike legislation this evening. A victory for the government is likely at this stage, but not one that brings the sides in all these multiple disputes any closer together. Romilly Weeks, News at 10.
And Robert's here to talk us through what prospect of any sort of way forward there is on this. I mean, when we were talking last week, there appeared to be a few glimmers of hope and optimism that something might come to strike a deal somewhere. It doesn't feel like that today.
No, it doesn't. And I think it's because both sides have worked out quite how far the gap is. I mean, in terms of public services, you know, schools, hospitals, I think most people would say they're the most important of those vital services. And actually, the big economic factor, if you work in those services, is since the end of the Labour government, frankly, their pay has fallen further and further behind those in the private sector. So did some sums today on the basis of ONS figures. At the end of, let's say 2009 or so, teachers were paid 1.7 times the average salary in the economy as an average for them. That has fallen to 1.4 times. Now, that is basically the government and the state saying they value teachers massively less, and at a time when inflation is so high, of course, that has a dramatic impact on their living standards. And, you know, you can tell exactly the same story for nurses. Now, last week, because nurses tell me, union leaders, that they want to end the strike, they were picking up signals from the government that they were open to an idea, for example, of this one-off bonus. But what the Treasury and Sunak, I think, have recognised is if they reopen this year's negotiation, they are, in a sense, admitting that the review body system that sets pay is bust, and that's sort of admitting that they've got to find a way to pay these people much more than they are currently being paid, which would cost billions, which we can't afford. But the problem with not fixing it is quality of schools, quality of hospitals goes down year by year because they cannot retain and recruit the people. And that is the fundamental problem at the moment. Not enough people working in both of those services.
Yeah, it's feeling pretty dicey tonight. Thank you very much indeed, Robert, for that. And in a quarter of a century of devolved government in Scotland, no law passed by its parliament has been blocked by its UK counterpart. Until now, Scotland's gender recognition bill has been stopped in its tracks, prompting fury from Scotland's First Minister. Nicola Sturgeon called it a full frontal attack on Scottish democracy.
Gender reform, making it easier for people in Scotland to change their gender and lowering the legal age from 18 to 16. It has been one of the most divisive debates since the dawn of devolution.
You're a man and I'm a woman. That's your opinion.
Now, it is a constitutional clash. Just weeks after the Scottish Parliament voted overwhelmingly to pass the Gender Reform Act, the UK government is legally trying to block it. The Scottish Secretary said in a statement, "I've not taken this decision lightly. The bill would have a significant impact on, amongst other things, GB-wide equalities matters in Scotland, England and Wales." Such an intervention from Westminster is unprecedented, but the Prime Minister had hinted at it on his visit to Scotland last week.
It's been a long-standing standard practice for the UK government to consider the impacts of laws that are passed in the Scottish Parliament on the entire UK.
But Nicola Sturgeon has called it a full frontal attack on Scottish democracy, with a human cost.
In my view, it will be quite simply a political decision, and I think it will be using trans people, already one of the most vulnerable, stigmatised groups in our society, as a political weapon, and I think that will be unconscionable and indefensible and really quite disgraceful.
Trans people like Danielle share that concern, particularly how today's news will affect younger people struggling to come out as trans.
Every single little knock that you feel there does hinder you from being yourself and coming out. You know, it's just another example of how they feel that they're either in the wrong or not accepted, when that's very much not the case.
This law was supposed to speed up the process for people in Scotland changing their gender. Instead, the whole legislation now comes to a complete halt. And after all the shouting, all the protests, it will finally be up to the courts to decide who is right in this debate, not morally, but legally. Peter Smith, News at 10, Glasgow.
Update now on the British support for the war in Ukraine. The Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has confirmed 14 British Army tanks will be sent to help repel the Russian invasion. The Challenger 2 tanks are the first to be supplied by a Western ally of Ukraine. The President says he needs 300 tanks altogether, but said the British ones would strengthen his forces on the battlefield and sent the right signal to other allies. The most wanted mafia boss in all of Italy has finally been arrested after 30 years. Matteo Messina Denaro was the last of 3 Sicilian godfathers still on the run. He was only 30 when he went into hiding. The police used an e-fit image of what he might look like now to track him down, and it was actually a decent likeness.
Escorted by 2 carabinieri and heavily guarded, the mafia boss who evaded capture for 30 years finally under arrest. Matteo Messina Denaro is thought to have been the top boss of Cosa Nostra, the Sicilian mafia. Denaro went into hiding 30 years ago and once boasted his victims would fill a cemetery. He was convicted in absentia for his part in dozens of murders, including bombings in 1992 that killed anti-mafia judges Giovanni Falcone and Paolo Borsellino. A year later, he planned bombings in Florence, Milan and Rome, killing 10 people and injuring almost 100. And he helped organise the kidnapping of 12-year-old Giuseppe Di Matteo in an attempt to stop his father testifying against the mafia. The boy was held for 2 years and then murdered. Today, Italy's Prime Minister congratulated the police officers involved in the capture of Denaro, calling it an historic day.
It's a day of feast for us. We can tell our children that the mafia can be defeated. We haven't won the war. We have not defeated the mafia yet, but this was a fundamental battle to win, and it is a hard blow for the organised crime.
Following years of investigations, Denaro was tracked down to La Maddalena clinic in Palermo, where he'd been receiving treatment for more than 12 months.
It is extraordinary that somebody so high profile has been hiding in plain sight for 30 years. Clearly, he has been protected by quite a number of people, I suppose in many sectors of life.
After 3 decades on the run, the man they called the last godfather is finally being brought to justice. Martha Fairley, News at 10.
The TV presenter and newspaper columnist Jeremy Clarkson has tried to draw a line under the insults he levelled against Meghan Markle in The Sun newspaper. He said he emailed the Duke and Duchess of Sussex on Christmas Day to say he was sorry, profoundly sorry. His TV employers, ITV and Amazon, were incandescent, he said. The couple weren't having any of it, though, and Rachel joins me now just to remind us, first of all, Rachel, about the column in question, which, you know, caused such sort of waves.
It did, didn't it? Because once you read those comments, they were almost impossible to forget. Even Clarkson's own daughter, Emily, was outraged by what he'd written. He said that he hated Meghan so much that he dreamt of the day when she'd be made to parade naked through the streets while the crowds threw lumps of excrement at her. It was vile. There was an enormous backlash, as you would expect. The Sun issued an apology, and Clarkson himself blustered that he'd rather put his foot in it and he would be rather more careful in future. Now, today, on his Instagram account, he has expanded on that, saying that he emailed Harry and Meghan on Christmas Day and that he said that he was really sorry, all the way from the balls of my feet to the follicles on my head. This is me putting my hands up. A mea culpa with bells on. Well, it might have been a mea culpa, but it wasn't one that prevented him from repeating in this same post a number of excuses, including the fact that he dashed this off very quickly. But it's the timing of this that I think is most interesting here, because he writes that both ITV and Amazon were incandescent. Look, they both made noises of disapproval at the time, but it's certainly arguable they could have gone further. And it now seems that there were rather more robust views expressed at the time. Amazon reported tonight to be going ahead with filming that's already been commissioned, but not commissioning anything beyond that when it comes to his shows. ITV making it clear that their position is similar.
And what have the Sussexes had to say about it?
Yeah, well, you won't be surprised that their spokesperson has frankly been pretty dismissive. They reject this apology because they simply don't believe it was a careless one-off. Their spokesperson saying what remains to be addressed is his long-standing pattern of writing articles that spread hate rhetoric, dangerous conspiracy theories and misogyny. It's clear that this is not an isolated incident shared in haste, but rather a series of articles shared in hate. So no sign of forgiveness there, but I think indications too tonight that his employers are also running out of patience.
OK, Rachel, thank you very much for that. Global bigwigs are congregating in the Swiss alpine air of Davos once again in numbers not seen since before the pandemic. Quite a lot has changed in the intervening 3 years since the last full World Economic Forum. The UK has left the European Union. Russia has, of course, invaded Ukraine, and the world faces far higher prices and higher inflation. Those pressures will eventually subside, but economists believe the threat from climate change will not.
The World Economic Forum is back. Once again, convoys of politicians, chief executives and celebrities are rolling into an upmarket ski resort aiming to solve the world's problems. The world has a lot of problems. For the moment, the cost of living crisis burns brightest. The market price of oil and gas has fallen sharply of late, but Kenneth Rogoff, once chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, urges caution.
Sometime this year, we'll be seeing light at the end of the tunnel. Things will start feeling better, but it's still, I've just started to say, a tough time right now with inflation's coming down, but it's still high. I think that a lot of countries are going to be in recession this year, including the UK.
The squeeze on living standards will end at some point, but when it does, countries and companies will still have to work together to deal with an even greater threat to our prosperity.
Snow was falling when we arrived in Davos yesterday, but there's not really very much of it. And over the last few decades, there's been a very clear trend of a reduction of both snow and ice across the Alps. The evidence points firmly to climate change, and the consensus here is that global warming is the biggest risk facing the world.
Climate activists are hoping they will be heard in Davos. Outside the conference centre, they're camping out in sub-zero temperatures, demanding change. Inside, the British government stands accused of moving too slowly towards net zero.
We've got to invest more in our grid structure. We've got to go still faster towards renewable energy. These are things where the government so far has said things that are okay, but it really hasn't got the oomph behind the policy.
The UK government recently approved plans to open a new coal mine in Cumbria. Is that compatible with net zero?
It absolutely isn't. It doesn't make any sense at all. If you produce more coal is consumed in the world, and that means more carbon dioxide. It is just a mad idea.
As it stands, the world is heading for 2.8 degrees of global warming. In picture-perfect Davos, that will mean less snow and less skiing. The consequences elsewhere, though, will be devastating. Joel Hills, News at 10 in Davos.
And finally, another gilded thread linking this present day to the golden age of Hollywood was broken today with the death of Gina Lollobrigida, one of its leading lights and leading ladies. She was 95. Her career began in Italy after the Second World War. By the 1950s in Hollywood, she was at the height of her fame, appearing opposite Humphrey Bogart, Frank Sinatra, Errol Flynn and Burt Lancaster, and was billed as the most beautiful woman in the world after starring in a film with that title.
Gina Lollobrigida's beguiling beauty and charm oozed Italian style, taking cinema by storm.
Wild warrior queen of the battlefields, mistress of all the arts of love.
Oh, come in and sit down.
In her day, she commanded the screen, acting with some of Hollywood's biggest names.
You better stay in the jungle.
You know, you don't look like a nurse.
I assure you I am. But I doubt if it's a nurse you require.
I can assure you we do.
Signora Gina, io so Joanna.
Last year, aged 94, she talked to Joanna Lumley for her ITV series, reflecting on life and those she met along the way, like Marilyn Monroe.
That's Marilyn. I do drawings. She was a very good friend of mine. First time I came to America.
She was the great star of Hollywood at the time, and she was the great star of the world, actually, but anyway, of Italy, for sure. In our world, you are a legend.
All the things that I did with my heart.
She withdrew from acting in the 70s, developing an eclectic career in singing, sculpture and photography, even interviewing Fidel Castro. Italy's culture minister said today her charm will remain eternal. Lollobrigida said she lived by a simple maxim: we are all born to die. The difference is the intensity with which we choose to live.
The 50s film star Gina Lollobrigida, who has died in Rome at the age of 95. And that is it from all of us for tonight. We'll see you tomorrow. Good night.